what actually do we mean by coloration? What is this analogy with the visual field? Obviously, people tend to think that we are a visual creature as opposed to an auditory one, and so it's very easy to draw parallel, or easier to understand things by drawing parallels with visual analogies. When we talk about coloration in sound, what we're talking about is the relative loudness of different frequencies, and the visual analogy is the relative different levels of different colours. So a very coloured loudspeaker is equivalent to putting a coloured filter in front of your eyes. Or indeed, maybe another analogy might be painting a light bulb. Why is coloration such an issue? Why are we so sensitive to these variations in frequency response that I'm going to talk about? Well, I believe that really it goes back to our evolution as a living creature, as an animal in the wild. Because there are an awful lot of times when you can't really see the thing that you need to know, and sound will give you an awful lot of information about that item. And it might be the ripeness of a fruit, or the soundness of a piece of wood, but just by tapping it with your knuckle, you can immediately tell a whole lot of stuff about what's happening behind its skin. Or perhaps you're in a darkened cave, creeping your way around, and just being able to judge the size of the void and the proximity of the walls just by hearing the comb filtering of the reflections. Maybe it's the thing which gives a little clue about the furry creature with big teeth that's coming up behind you. All of these things are a life and death matter, and having acute auditory sense might save your life. But more recently, of course, we've developed musical instruments, violin makers and the like have been honing their art, and our ears have become more and more sensitive as a result to hearing the difference in quality between one piece of wood and another. The net result, of course, is therefore we're incredibly sensitive to those qualities when they are a part of reproduced sound. And in the main, the biggest culprit of in terms of coloration and frequency and time domain are the loudspeakers. So that's where most work can be done, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. My real start to my career in the loudspeaker industry came when I joined the company belonging to this chap, John Bowers, the company being, of course, Bowers and Wilkins loudspeakers. I actually joined as an electronic engineer, but my real interest was loudspeakers, but I didn't know how much I didn't know until I met this guy. Now, he gave me the task of pursuing the development of a moving coil equivalent to electrostatics. Now, John had created this landmark product, the DM70, back in the early 70s. Basically, a closed box moving coil base unit, but with this electrostatic mid and high frequency unit mounted on top. Now, that electrostatic head did have a wonderful open quality. Really, it was difficult to match. The conjunction with a moving coil base unit is simply because actually shifting enough air with electrostatics was always a bit of a challenge. And the original quad, now known as a Quad 57, was, whilst being a superlative loudspeaker in so many respects, simply not capable of reproducing the level of a large orchestra. This hybrid was, in some ways, a wonderful best of both worlds solution. The truth was, even in conjunction with that base unit, it was limited in its maximum SPL. And so, going back one slide, that's why in the late 70s, John and his team developed the landmark 801. That was used in so many recording studios and became really quite ubiquitous. But John was always bothered. There was something about the 801 which didn't quite match the mid-range qualities, he used to put it. So my job, I was charged with the task of trying to work out what it was about the 801 which didn't match the DM70, and indeed to see if the solution might be a question of the the difference between a monopole and a dipole. The DM70 was a dipole, the 801 was a monopole. That is to say that the sound from the back of the diaphragm was constrained in a little box. And John had always suspected that maybe the big difference was the fact that the DM70 was this dipole, so as much sound comes out of the back as comes out of the front. So my first line of inquiry was to put Kevlar drivers on what was known as a Brownmuir and Weber resistive baffle. That is to say, the original form, which isn't there, the original one was literally a rectangular baffle with fabric stretched across the frame and the drivers mounted in the middle. And the idea is that it behaves as more and more of a baffle as you go down and down in frequency. So it's an expanding baffle, which of course is quite an interesting approach. Now, as it happens, the rectangular frame was far from ideal for reasons that I will actually come to in a bit, and so I tried various other exotic approaches, and the most successful was actually this flower petal arrangement. The cloth, of course, isn't there, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see the flower petals, but that was the rigid, the shape of the rigid material underneath, but it was then cloaked in a thick woolen fabric. Once we dealt with the cabinet resonances by effectively eliminating them, it became quite clear that the next most obvious thing was the sound of the cone itself. Now at that stage, Kevlar was still a wonderful new material, and B&W really truly believed that it was the non plus ultra of the loudspeaker world, and so it was a little bit difficult for them to stomach the fact that, well, maybe it was actually not as perfect as we'd thought. But bit by bit, as I looked into it, it became clear that that was the issue. Kevlar sounded like Kevlar, paper sounded like paper, plastic, as up there on the right, sounded decidedly like a plastic cup. So really at that point I started to look for a new type of driver, something which didn't have this sonic signature, which had, was clearly the issue with these devices. As B&W at that time were just beginning to use metal domed tweeters, it seemed logical that the next thing to try was a larger metal dome. And as you can see in this early prototype here, we have a line of 3 50mm metal domes. And they really do behave pretty damn well, right up to the first breakup frequency, which in that case, those original metal domes, was about 11 kilohertz. So that's a prototype of a loudspeaker, and this is a prototype of some of the loudspeakers, and eventually that became the prototype of another loudspeaker, which ended up with this loudspeaker, which you may all recognize. That Nautilus design is very free of coloration. There is no question. I'm very proud of what we achieved there. Let's go further into understanding what those sources of coloration are and why the Nautilus did actually manage to get over most of them. So, as I said before, coloration is caused by unevenness in the perceived frequency response, which could be, and usually is, caused by resonance, but can also be the result of reflections and diffraction. There are, some people would actually use the word coloration to apply to nonlinear effects like distortion, but I prefer to call them distortion. So I keep them separate, and I'm not going to talk about nonlinear distortion today. I am just going to stick to resonance, reflection, and diffraction. Okay, resonance, so what's that about? Resonance, ping, drinking lead crystal glass, bell, tube, any of those things. It's something we're very familiar with. And in each case, it's caused by a system where you have 2 forms of stored energy, usually a spring and a mass. And the mass moves or bounces on the spring, and the energy is exchanged between potential energy in the spring and kinetic energy in the mass. Resonance can have, it has a frequency, it has a Q factor, which is the purity of the resonance, and it's the length of time for which the thing will carry on ringing after the stimulus has been removed. But also the strength of coupling. So you can have something with a strong resonance, but it's remote. Literally, you can have a wine glass in another part of the room, not very closely coupled with the loudspeaker, so you won't hear the glass resonating unless you actually put your ear right next to it. Or you can have the opposite extreme, where it's the actual diaphragm itself which is doing the resonating, and then it's extremely audible. Again, I'll use that analogy. It's like having a coloured light bulb. There's very little you can do about fixing the effects of a resonance if it's actually coming from the diaphragm itself. So let's start with some measurements. And I'll start with the point at which my investigations began, and that's the Kevlar cone. Now this is a very typical and quite well regarded Kevlar cone, not actually a B&W one, I'll admit. And you can see, this is the frequency response, and you can see that it has these irregularities, and that means that these frequencies will be subjectively louder than others. But most importantly, you can see the way they behave in the time domain. They carry on ringing, which means they have a, we call it a high Q. It means they're much more noticeable. So we have to improve, what is cone breakup? I use this term, I bandy this term around. What actually do I mean? Well, if this is the cross-section of the cone and the voice coil is here, at low frequencies, of course, it moves together, and as you gradually increase the frequency, the edge starts to get left behind, and eventually, at some point, it will start to flap, and that tends to occur at one frequency, and then it flaps a little bit further in, and that's a higher frequency, and as you go up the frequency spectrum, the flexure goes further and further in until really only the part of the cone right next to the voice coil actually is moving with the coil. Everything else is just a sea of chaos. And frankly, it's something which I think we can do without in a good loudspeaker. Okay, so what's a better loudspeaker? Well, I already mentioned metal domes. A very easy way of making a loudspeaker with a metal cone or dome is to stick a normal sized little voice coil somewhere near the apex of the cone, and indeed it does work pretty well. This is, again, a highly regarded little full range loudspeaker. And you can see it also has these peaks and troughs in the response. But I can tell you that whilst these are structural nodes, they are cone or dome, in this case breakup, this one is caused by a different effect. That one is an acoustic effect. That's actually caused by the cavity at the front. Now, we all know that if you blow across a milk bottle, you'll get a note, a nice pure note. As you change the volume, the note gets higher, or you open the mouth, the frequency gets higher. And indeed, my mouth is a cavity resonator, and as I go wow, 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 that's just a Helmholtz resonator filtering the sound of my vocal cords. So that's a really common resonator. But resonators don't always look as obvious as a milk bottle or an organ. Even something as shallow as an ashtray, to know the thing, has an associated resonance because it has a little bit of an air volume and it has a bit of depth. These curves show a series of shallow cavities, and they show the effect. If you were to put sound in the back wall of that shallow cavity, they show the effect that has on the acoustic response on the outside. So you can see that something where the diameter is about 6 times the depth has a lump of about 3 decibels. Well, that is pretty much what you have with a lot of conical loudspeakers. You've got a cavity and a surround, and those things conspire together, and you get this lump. Usually, for a typical cone loudspeaker, it's around 2 kilohertz. Actually, that particular sort of resonance can be EQ'd out because it's right there at the source. It's low Q, so putting a notch in the frequency response, a notch in the crossover, will actually sort that one out, which is unusual because most of the time, for instance, with the Kevlar, if you were to equalize all those little peaks and troughs in the response to the Kevlar loudspeaker, it still would sound like a Kevlar loudspeaker because of the way that it squirts beams of sound in all sorts of different directions, and you can only really equalize it in one spot. So, an inverted metal dome, in so many ways, a good start, but that hollow is a disadvantage. So, as I said, at the time B&W were experimenting with, or actually we'd gone into production with 26mm tweeter domes, and they seem to work jolly well. So I thought, okay, let's expand the thing, let's make it a 50mm dome so it'll be good for mid-range. But whereas a classic tweeter dome uses a solid disc of magnet, that traps a tiny little air volume behind it, and that gives you a very attenuated low frequency response. You have to open up the space behind the diaphragm. You can do it with a ringed magnet and a hole in the middle, or the way we later did it with Vivid. I'm afraid this is actually a Vivid image. At B&W we used an annular magnet with a hole down the middle, but the effect is the same. You have a hole at the back of the loudspeaker. Oh no, a chamber of air with a hole. What's going to happen? You get this beautifully pure but very audible resonant dip. The resonance is on the back, but the fact that it's on the back doesn't help. It really couples strongly with the diaphragm, and that's the effect. Now you have got that nice low frequency response. This is the closed driver. You've got a nice low frequency response, but that is a stinker of a resonance, and that would stand out like a sore thumb. So we have to do something about that. My initial experiments were, of course, to put a chamber on the back, because that's what we tend to do when you with a loudspeaker. You've got to get rid of that radiation from the back. It's out of phase with the radiation from the front. You don't want it mixing with it, so you try to enclose it. All the chamber designs I tried initially suffered from their own eigentones, which is the sound bouncing between the faces, the internal faces of the chamber. The solution was to put a pipe on it, and whilst the original design just used parallel-sided pipes, as I think you saw in some earlier pictures, it turned out that an even better solution is to use an exponential pipe with graduated stuffing. Now I have a little demonstration here. It's the only demonstration I'm going to give you today. If I talk into this pipe, you can hear quite clearly the resonances as the energy bounces between the ends. And this is an exponentially damped tube, and it pretty much mops up all the fundamental resonances. You can still hear the lateral resonances. They're much, much higher in frequency, but basically the internal resonances disappear. That thing could be attached to all sorts of systems and work equally well. It's a very tolerant technology, actually. You can stick it more or less anywhere and it will absorb sound. Okay, so how does it work? Pretty well, as it happens. You can see what we've got back, our low frequency performance, and it's absolutely free of resonant effects. So that's pretty cool. What about the diaphragm itself? Anything we can do there? Well, we were pretty chuffed with the 50mm diaphragm as it stood, but 11 kilohertz, that's pretty audible. Was there anything we could do about it? Well, the first thing I did, it's actually an old trick, is to put a stiff peripheral member on the outside. So in this case, a ring of carbon fibre. It's a system which actually is as old as the hills. The dome in Florence Cathedral used a series of wrought iron chains around the outside, and the Astrodome in Houston, was it? Used steel cables, and again, parabolic or catenary shape. And that gives a huge improvement in the performance. So this is the plain metal dome. You can see that strong resonance there. It's about 12K in this particular case. And then you put the carbon fibre ring on and it shifts it right out of audibility. So it really is now, to all intents and purposes, a pretty perfectly pistonic driver. It's not the only way of getting a pretty perfect pistonic driver. Ribbons are pretty damn good because the force is applied evenly across the whole thing. You've got a ribbon carrying a current immersed in an even magnetic field, and the whole thing experiences the same force right across it. There's a variation on the ribbon, which is called an air motion transformer, equally good. Everything's moved through 90 degrees, and the ribbon looks pleated, and the alternate pleats move in and out in opposite phase, and the air gets squished in and out between the pleats. But the effect is the same. It's driven evenly all over, and the response is really very, very good. ESL I've already mentioned, same sort of thing, even drive right across the surface, so the whole thing moves in a very perfect way. Or, I've often said, if I had my time again, if I'd met a different employer back in the 80s, I might well have become a ribbon speaker designer or an air motion transformer designer. ESL is never going to go quite loud enough. ESL just really isn't rock and roll, whereas ribbons and AMTs, excellent system of reproducing sound. I could quite happily be one of those, and still could. And then finally, I've got ionic or plasma. Now, what's wonderful about ionic or plasma loudspeakers is that the diaphragm now is the air itself. You've actually injected electric charge into the air so you can move it around with an external field, or in the classic plasma tweeter, you just vary the volume of this ball of plasma, and it's a virtually massless diaphragm, which is excellent. The only thing is it's very small, and to get a decent amount of sound out of one of those things is you really have to put a horn on it. I'll come to horns later. A good horn works perfectly well, but a bad horn might be a compromise. So, back to Kevlar. I'm going to give you some measurements now, show you some measurements and show you the effects of some resonant and other perturbations in the vicinity of the diaphragm. First of all, I'll show you Kevlar because I want you to get some idea of the magnitude of the imperfections that you might possibly have in the field. But this is the alloy dome for comparison. You can see how really it does behave in such a lovely way. It just, at the end of the signal, it just drops. So, we're going to look at the effects of nearby sources of resonance. Now, first of all, I expand the time window so you can resolve some more detail in that falling section of the waterfall plot. So, this is just a short tube, a 1-inch tube, 6mm internal diameter, closed at one end, just held near one of these drivers, just in free space. I don't have a photograph of that, unfortunately. So you can see the way that, whilst in the steady state response, which this is, it's barely visible. That little wiggle, if I just whiz back to the Kevlar, if that little wiggle in this lot, you'd lose it. You really wouldn't see it. But the cumulative decay plot shows you that that little wiggle actually is a pretty long-lived and ultimately audible resonance. A 38 by 200mm tube. Well, this is a 38mm tube, so imagine a 200mm long section. Again, barely noticeable in the steady state, strongly noticeable in the decay part of the spectrum. Why is that relevant? Well, a 38 by 200mm tube is a pretty typical dimension for a port tube. So port tubes are very often in the vicinity of a driver, so you do have to be careful where you put your port tube. And sometimes you may have to put it in the back or something like that, because it might actually solve the problem there. Anyway, something to watch out. What about holes in the baffle? Because now you put a square baffle around it. I'll come back to diffraction, but as soon as you put a square baffle around it, it completely messes up the decay field, and you could again easily lose a little resonance caused by a hole like that. So, but you can just about make it out in the further tail of the decay part of the spectrum. Other sorts of cavities, well, on the back of a driver, typically the magnet, which is a solid, it might be a solid pole, inside the voice coil, behind the dust cap. As it stands, that tends to damp the motion at low frequencies because the air has to escape through the tiny little magnetic gap. So what many manufacturers do is drill a great big hole through the back, and of course, hey presto, what you've got but a resonator. There it is, nice, strong, long-lived resonance. In this particular example, what we do to sort it out is drill many, many holes in the voice coil former. As you can see, that pretty much gets rid of it. If you look at some of those other effects, they're in both. They're due to the environmental measurements, other resonant things. Okay, that was one of our loudspeakers. Here's that off-the-shelf little aluminium dome. Same sort of thing, it's got a hole in the back to allow the thing to breathe. Honking great resonance, put my finger over the hole, gone. So you do have to watch out for these things. They are, they're there, they're real, and it's so easy to sort out. That's the thing. Okay, reflection. We tend to think of reflection in terms of room acoustics. It's very easy to hear. You clap your hands, you hear the reflection coming back. But as the boundary, source of reflection, moves closer and closer to the loudspeaker, you cease to be able to differentiate it as a separate signal. It becomes part of the, effectively part of the sound, but as the phase moves in and out, it either reinforces or cancels the sound, and that becomes audible. I can do this. Sometimes you can hear the phasing effect, but it's a little bit subtle. I should really get a big piece of wood for that. This is a D50 again with a microphone, big piece of wood. Here you can see very clearly the reflected signal in phase, and here is the comb filtering effect. Okay, that's going to happen anytime you get a sound source near a reflective surface. And you know the most obvious and constant reflective surface is the floor. We all live with the floor reflection, the floor bounce, as some people call it. So much so that we don't really notice it as part of the loudspeaker's frequency response. In fact, it's a bit unnerving if you have a loudspeaker which doesn't have a floor bounce. In some recording studios, they dig a huge pit in the floor and fill it with foam to attenuate that thing. But a recording studio, of course, is not a real world, you know. It's actually a very analytical one. But still, yeah, a very real effect. But what about other sources of reflection? Like, for instance, putting a frame around the cabinet. Now, it's an old style thing. And here's an old style loudspeaker, and here's another fairly old style. I don't want to be rude about other people's design, but I'm just going to show you one or two little examples of things, just quickly as I whiz around the show, that sometimes people still do things which, frankly, you ought not to. Okay, so just two little pieces of wood either side, so really just part of a frame, and you can see that it puts 5 or 6 dB wiggles in the frequency response. You can EQ them in this day and age of Trunoffs and other wonderful pieces of equipment. You can equalize that sort of thing, but the problem is that it has a different frequency response as you move around. So in fact, if you were to equalize that thing on axis, when you moved off axis, the problem would be even worse. It's far better to stop the problem at source. So, as you said, so that, I think I can name that one because it's a JBL. It's a really old design. They do it as a legacy product, and no, you know, you tend not to do that. Okay, gaps between boxes. Oh my God, quick blink. Ooh, there's loads of them around. Gaps between separate sections. Look at that. It's really, you know, it's a strong effect. You would think people would avoid that. Anyway, I'll quickly whiz across this. Okay, diffraction. Diffraction is in fact very useful because if you didn't have diffraction and you had a little pistonic driver, the sound would just come out as a pencil-thin beam and you'd have to be right on axis. But actually, as long as the wavelength is significantly larger than the diaphragm, the sound spreads out nicely. And we can walk around the loudspeaker and hear a good frequency response everywhere in the room. Okay, the sound spreads out from the driver, it follows the surface of the baffle, but what happens when you reach the edge of the baffle? Forget my slides. Hang on. Right, so there's a driver, those are the waves, it hits the baffle, and the sudden shock of going from being bounded on one side to being in free space is almost as much of a shock as hitting a solid wall, and you get a re-radiation from the corner. Now, of course, that radiation is going to mix with the original signal, and depending on the wavelength, the frequency, and the position, those waves are either going to add or subtract. Again, you can equalize these things, but if you equalize them in one spot, they'll be worse in another. So much better to avoid creating them in the first place. Oh, hang on. So I said over 60, I think it's 70 years now since Olsen first published a book on loudspeakers. And he did some very simple experiments. He got a big round ball. Each one of these things was about this sort of size. He put a little loudspeaker, 1-inch loudspeaker in the side of all these objects, and showed how the effects of diffraction can really mess up the response of things with square edges, and that really the best shape is always going to be a ball. So here's a very similar little driver. It's 26mm dome. It's not utterly smooth because, in fact, that little baffle, in effect, 50mm baffle, means that a frequency is going to be a little bit louder than the rest. So it's not perfect, but at least it's free of sharp features, sharp wiggles. This is a little circular baffle. Circular baffle's the worst shape, of course, because everything is the same distance. So the diffraction coming from that edge is going to add or subtract to the sound on axis at very distinct frequencies. And you can see that. This, again, it's cone filtering. The phase, as I said, is opposite to the reflection, but the effect is pretty simple. And the solution is so simple. You just put it in a curved surface and that problem pretty much goes away. There is a little bit of a wiggle there, but there is a little bit of a rim on the bowl. It's just, you know, the bowl from a shop, it's not perfect. And the other solution is to stick it on the side, the curved side of a cylinder. Again, there are some little wiggles there you can see because the end, I haven't taken any care whatsoever over the end, but they're so far away that you can't get away with that. But I'm actually very proud of that response. I just did this experiment before I came to Munich, and I'd never put one of these actual drives in the side of just a simple tube, and it just works rather wonderfully well. Okay, so I think I've shown you the pitfalls that can trip you up when sticking a little driver in the side of a cabinet. Let's return to again to where I started with dipoles. Great, you drive and I'm talking here about things like electrostatics and magnetoplanars. You drive the whole surface equally, which is obviously fairly wonderful, but there is still a chance of a bit of an issue because if you have this even source of sound which suddenly stops at the edge, it is also, that sudden stop is also a source of effectively of diffraction issues, and you will get cone filtering effects if you don't take some sort of action. So you can either gradually fade away the signal as you reach the edge, or round the frame, actually, or have a big circular frame, or have an absorbent frame. But yeah, you can do something about it, but you do have to watch out for it. The dipole, the electrostatic or whatever, is fundamentally perfect, but stick it in a real environment, and you do still have to take a few precautions. Horns. I really like horns, actually, I have to say. Again, putting another hat on, I did work for a professional sound company. I thought, you know, they're just great. They transform all the energy, well, actually 50% of the energy from the source, into real sound energy out there in the big wide world. And done properly, they are free of resonance. I use this little expression, all the world is a horn, because, okay, a flat baffle effectively is a cone with 180 degrees included angle. I mean, a straight conical horn like this, we all understand as being a horn, but as you gradually open the sides out to flatness, it's still a horn. A driver in the wall is effectively horn loaded. And even actually a driver in free space. In effect, it's a 4 pi serradian horn. The problem with horns is just the transition between the horny bit and the free field outside. So simple precautions, curve it to the edge, and most of the horns you'll see today are beautifully curved at the edges, but I did spot one which was a bit, not sure about that. Do we know it all? I mean, here I am telling you all about what I've learned over the years, and I'm very proud of the speakers we've made, and you know, incorporated all of this where I can, all of this learning into it. I see something like that, and I think, that's pretty rough. I don't think that's going to sound very good. Can anyone guess what this not very good looking loudspeaker is? It's quite old. It's the good old quad electrostatic. Now, the irony is, because the measurement looks pretty poor, but it's still regarded as one of the finest of the old school loudspeakers. So I think, you know, in response, no, we don't know everything about it, but we do try, and I will keep on trying. Okay, that's the end of that. Any questions?
Definitely. What about board, for example? There are some companies who are saying that's the evil to put a board in a box. Some others are using board.
Yeah, well, it's a choice you make. People put ports in boxes because it gives you about a half an octave of extension for a given size of driver and a given volume of box. It gives you about half an octave of extension, in which the driver amplitude is actually less, and of course that means that as long as the port flow is aerodynamically smooth, then actually it means you get less distortion across that band. The downside is, of course, that the low frequency response falls off more quickly, and as I said earlier, having tubes in the vicinity, there is a risk that they will cause resonances. So, you have to be careful. If it's a bass mid driver in an enclosure with a port, yeah, there's a risk. That bass mid might excite resonances. Whether or not you like the sound of reflex as opposed to closed box, well, that's very much a matter of taste. Ultimately, a closed box is possibly the more accurate, but the price is that effectively for the same amount of sound, it's going to have to be bigger, it's going to need more power. These are decisions, you have to make. No, there's no one right answer, You make a choice.
Are those aluminum on? So if you had cost no object,
yeah,
would you say, well, metal domes, you love them? Is there a benefit in your thoughts of going to magnesium or even boron or something else?
Magnesium, boron, titanium, aluminium, they're more or less in the same. Actually, boron's a bit higher, but it's a little bit tricky to make nice thin diaphragm. Magnesium, aluminium, titanium are all more or less in the same ballpark. Beryllium, that's out there. That's an octave of improvement over aluminium, and diamond is another half octave still. Of course, diamond and beryllium have their own difficulties and costs. When we were developing these drivers, I was let's be frank about this, we didn't have a huge amount of resources, and the tooling and cost of beryllium was a little bit daunting. The two suppliers of diamond had exclusivity deals with the two manufacturers who I'm sure you know. So diamond was just simply not possible at that time. Beryllium was fraught, and it was at the time when I was applying computer FEA optimization to the profile and this carbon fiber stiffener. And what I found was that by appropriately shaping and reinforcing, you could actually get performance with aluminium, which is it's pretty respectable. We get a 42 kilohertz breakup with this. The same thing in beryllium is probably about 60. It's quite a long way beyond the audio band anyway. We can afford beryllium now. Possibly, it's actually possible to get a diamond film made by other people. But we sort of lost interest because we're very happy with our aluminium tone. So it's one of those things. Yeah, we might do beryllium at some point. I don't really see much point in going the diamond route. But beryllium maybe, yeah, that's quite practical. You can stamp beryllium with fairly conventional tools. It's just, we've played with samples of beryllium and even a diamond. And the interesting thing is, we've done subjective tests. In both cases, people chose the aluminium. I'm treading carefully because I can't give you a proper explanation. Personally, I think it's because it wasn't just a beryllium or a diamond dome on our tweeter. It was actually somebody else's beryllium driver and somebody else's diamond. So you're changing quite a few things at the same time. It might not have been the diaphragm itself. It might be. For instance, we put lots of effort into getting a lot of magnetic flux into these drivers, so they're very efficient compared to most people. And that means that the power compression is less, the damping is better. And then we've got this hole at the back as well, which the beryllium driver didn't. So, sorry, does that answer your question? Okay. These both have breakups that are well outside the audio band. This one is the audio band, but then the crossover frequency is a lot further down. So actually, there's such a margin between the crossover frequency and its first breakup that I'm pretty happy that it's safe. But yeah, we have looked at not necessarily pure beryllium, but beryllium aluminium alloys for the low mid. And the basic is just no point, it's just miles away. The first breakup's at 2 kilohertz. you're crossing over at 200 hertz, a margin of 10. Right. Okay, Eddie? Yeah.
You were talking about pipes that also can add, can have, let's say, problems with resonance inside. But I think the matrix box is also, let's say, at the back of the speaker, also a lot of
A jumble
pipes.
of pipes. Yeah.
I know you put it in because of the resonance of the cabinet, but
No,
does it
no,
have some?
that's the structural resonance of the
Yeah.
enclosure. Yeah.
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 But did it also have effect on the refraction, for example, inside the cabinet?
Actually, it was all right there because the relative sizes of the chambers and the holes meant that the effects that you're quite reasonably talking about are safely out of band for the frequencies that the box was recreating. But I know that later B&W did do some experiments with actually deliberately making the holes of a certain size so that they could deliberately affect the propagation of the sound waves within the box, which is actually it's a very interesting thing. It gives you some very interesting. You can slow the speed of sound down. Yeah, in effect. But you can slow the speed down at some frequencies, but you can also get some horrible resonance at others. So.
Thank you.
Can we, the design of these loudspeakers, what can you tell us about the shape, or why did you choose it like that? How was it developed?
Well,
it looks nice, it's one thing, but...
Yeah, actually, that's the thing is, I say often, when I'm actually giving a presentation on B&W loudspeakers, my first thing is, look, people think that we just do this for the design. We don't. We're engineers. We start off from an engineering perspective, and it ends up looking that way for, mostly for a reason. This curly spiral thing on the side, that's just pure frippery. But okay, well, you know what's going on behind these. They've all got these exponential tubes. I've already explained that they just absorb the rear sound. And then the smooth curve on the outside, you saw that slide with the driver in the side of the cylinder.
Yes.
It just works very well. There's no single point where you can say, oh, that's the front and that's the side, or whatever. It's just a smooth transition. So the sound wave never really sees a point at which it goes from one thing to another. So, yeah, so there's no diffraction.
What is it made of, the cabinet?
It's made from, just a moment.
Oh yes, please. Can I take
I'd be. Do you know what? That's a good idea. That's a very good idea. We should have samples with our name on them.
Yeah.
Check out. I'll tell you one thing though. That's got a foam core, whereas in the real thing we use balsa core for the shell. The foam core is used for the braces that are put in laterally.
But it's very hard. I cannot press it. Like
No, and also that's not really what it's all about. It's the bending that's why we do it like that. Yeah.
But that's not carbon fiber, right?
No, it's just glass with black resin.
Okay.
Thanks. I think.
Yay.
Do you know what? I'll answer your carbon fibre question. Some people say, why don't you use carbon fibre for your speakers? What I've always said is that the shell, the purpose of the shell is that it has to contain the sound from the bass unit, and it has to do so without having its own resonant modes. What determines the panel resonances? It's the combination of the stiffness and the mass per unit area. We can achieve any resonant frequency that we can achieve with carbon skins, we can achieve with glass, but it will weigh more because we'll have to put more glass on it. And what I always say is, look, if we were going to send these things into space, then we'd make them from carbon. But as long as they sit on the ground in people's living rooms, and glass does just fine.
From the weight of it, it doesn't weigh. So, how come you have mass? Like how come it's so? It's a heavy speaker.
Yeah, but a lot of that is the magnets in the bass unit.
Oh.
Actually, more than half of the weight is the crossover in the magnets. Yeah, quite a lot more.
I was just wondering, like when you mentioned the crossover, have having put so much mechanical engineering into the drive units,
Yeah.
do they need much work in the crossover domain? Is it quite simple first order, or
No,
is there a
well,
lot to them?
We use fourth order overall, so the slopes are linked to Friday fourth order, because the driver has its natural second order boxing performance, and it has a sort of first order droop. So the actual electrical filter response tends to be a second order high pass and a third order low pass to get the bands. But we don't like super low orders, because you end up putting a lot of power into drivers at frequencies where they're not really meant to be. At low frequencies, if you have first order response, genuinely first order response on a tweeter, the output, the displacement would carry on increasing, so actually base frequencies would get through to the tweeter at a significant level. So we prefer to have fourth order for those, definitely. And at the high frequencies, if you only have a first order, then, you know, earlier when I said that the breakup of this isn't a problem, well, if we only had first order, it would actually become audible. So we tend to stick to fourth order. And besides which, actually, they so knit together really, really nicely. So.
And are all these parts of the circuit, are they shunt, or are any of them in series with the drivers?
Both.
Or both?
They're pretty classic ladder filters.
Yeah.
And are those crossovers calculated, or is it really?
Well, actually, do you know what? They're not. They're. I use network analysis and optimization. I'm drifting slightly into a Vivid Audio presentation. I'm very aware of you guys. It's not. I do have a whole different show in which I'll talk to you about optimization. But basically, I joined B&W, as I said, as an active loudspeaker engineer, because that's what I'd done for fun before, while I was at university. And the very first thing I did there was design active filters. And I thought it's the only way of, and I see these people messing around with coils and capacitors, literally plugging them in. Does it go up? No. Oh, take it out, put it on. And just fiddling around by trial and error, watching the response each time, measuring the response, and seeing, anyway. Oh God, that looks like too much hard work. So I stuck to actives, and when we did the Nautilus, I did it absolutely with an active filter. When I joined my South African colleagues to start this escapade, they said, no way can we do actives, because, you know, it's already a silly shape, nobody's going to buy it if it's active as well. So since then, and so the point was like, oh God, passive filters, I'm not even sure I can do those. Anyway, one of my colleagues said, have you tried LEAP, crossover analysis and optimization? And my God, it's just completely transformed it. It's actually a pleasure to design a crossover with LEAP. You measure the driver responses in the quasi-anechoic conditions, you feed the numbers into LEAP. You have to know a little bit about passive filters. I mean, it doesn't design it for you. You have to give it a basic filter circuit. You give it a target response, and then you click on which components you feel might need changing, which might be all of them, and then you just go optimize, and it just goes round. It's a dumb program. It just goes round and round, changing all the values. Does it make it better? Yes. Does it make it better? Yes. Does it make, oh no, worse. Stop there. Go to another value. Up, down, and it just goes round and round the loop, constantly changing, and the frequency response is there. You can see it working until gradually it will get as close as possible. It's brilliant. It's actually, very. And the funny thing is that since then, I've sort of changed my mind about active. I said, no, you don't really need active. Who benefits from active? Amplify makers. Now, it happens that, of course, what we're doing today is fully active, because the Trinoff box is just a dog, you know, really. It does everything you could want. But what the Trinoff box does that no passive minimum phase crossover could ever do, and that's equalise the phase response. And that, I mean, to me, that's magical.
Again, to the frequency response, are you going by engineering? Is your target like linear, or are you pushing a bit more
Bottom.
bottom?
If you've got a broad dispersion, which these do, then you find that the power response in room sounds too bright if it's flat. So you always drop it by 2 or 3 dB between 100
across
and 20.
the spectrum.
That's what people, I suppose, call voicing. A bit cautious with that term, because I'm not quite sure what it means. Okay. One more.
So, with bass, you talk about in another world you really love horns, and I think the best bass I heard here was that ancient RC kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I built myself a giant open baffle bass thing that's massive, and nothing seems to. I don't know why it sounds so much more evolving.
I know.
Or is it? What's going on there?
Okay, look. I had a little experience when we launched the original G1 in Seoul, Korea. After the presentation, our distributor said, "Are you interested in historical equipment?" Well, of course I am. You've got to know where you've been before you know where you're going. And so he said, "Oh, I've got a good friend who is very interested in Western Electric." And it was Mr. Chung who does Silvertone. Anyway. So I was invited to come to his basement where he has just this incredible collection of lovely old equipment. But there in the end of the room are these two gigantic wooden W horns with field coil 18s, and then on top of them a multi-cell 3x6 with a pair of 594 field coil. It's the whole thing, and with the original rack and everything. And he's there badgering me, saying, "How do you think it sounds? Hey, how do you think it sounds?" So we'll be polite about this. I'm not saying a character. I say, "Ah, you think it sounds colour?" It was the most amazing and beautiful experience. It's like the sound just comes out, and I think, well, it might be colour, but it's a lovely shade of warmth. So yeah, I knew I'd met my match there. There is something magical. Like I say, we say we know what we're doing and we can measure all these effects, and we do try, but then you see something like that which on paper looks pretty rough and it sounds just delicious. And similarly with that Western Electric system, I'm sure it must have measured pretty. It would have had peaks and troughs all over the shop, but it was just lovely. So we keep trying. I've got a distinct. I'll go on one more. I've got a distinct feeling we really should allow Trinov to get back to their demonstration, but I'm quite happy to carry on yabbering for ages outside. Sorry.
I just have a very silly question. How do I sound?
Yeah. That's
perfect.
That's a segue point.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. That's why I was standing in the hallway because people were coming in looking for demos. And I was like, no, we're doing a presentation. We'll be doing demos soon, but we need to let Laurence finish. And obviously, you were all asking really interesting questions.
Can we listen to the reels?
You want to start with that and then go back to stereo?
Just for him.
Okay. I need my remotes.
The 3D sound. 3D recordings with multi-channel.
Oh, then all the other speakers are coming up.
I mean, we can do upmixing here, like we can as well. Not only stereo. But then it's artificially upmixed, right? Now,
Do you know where the other remote is?
He also has a remote, I think.